I've read Dr. Wilson's beautiful book, Half Earth, and I I always just wonder what does constitute the half,
Yeah,
because there's a lot of different ways to conserve land, and a lot of different uses that are apparent on conserved land. So can you just describe, for the benefit of maybe Northeast Wilderness Trust members that might watch this,
yeah,
how does the half come to the mission of Northeast Wilderness Trust, or how is it related to what our work is doing?
yeah. Yeah, no, it's a great question, John. I like the way, so just to frame it a little bit, right? So Ed wrote this, as he does, he wrote this inspiring, influential book called Half Earth. Um, and, it was really, in some ways, the culmination of Ed's conservation thinking and realizing we need a big goal and that we've been kind of, in some ways, trapped in incremental process. Like conservation works, but there's a little bit of it feeling like an endless piecemeal project. And we don't have the clear answer, but Ed became convinced that we need this goal. And so the common question is, the way the questions usually go is, why half? And the answer to that is pretty straightforward, actually. It's based on science. Half gets you averaged, very, very much averaged over the whole globe. Half gets you probably about 85% of the species, 85% of all of biodiversity, and that is gonna ensure all the functioning systems that, in fact, from a utilitarian perspective, we completely depend on these services, right?
Sure.
Clean air, clean water, many other things that people don't even think about, right? We need the functioning biosphere. It does not need us. We're not a keystone species in that regard. So there's that. And then the next question is, so sort of why half, and then which half? And I like, what you're framing is the more nuanced version of that. And I think half works at two levels. One is, there's no doubt that and we have the science and the scientists working on this now. How do we look at the global distribution of biodiversity and prioritize the lands that both hold the richest biodiversity on the planet and also the richness of undiscovered species? Because we always have to remember, even in New England, there's species to be discovered, but in the tropics, that's times 1,000. So we actually live on this little explored, poorly documented planet when it comes to life on this planet. But then the next level is, there's all sorts of things we can do beyond the simple notion of acquiring land. And I think a lot of people have this vision of, and keeping people out of it. Now, I love your organization's mission that we're talking about the sort of extreme end of the spectrum of really the primary purpose is for wilderness and biodiversity, and to control as much as possible human use and incursion. But there's all sorts of issues about connectivity,
Sure.
restoring, better agricultural practices, getting rid of invasives, restoring native species, all those sorts of things. So, I think that, for the global map that we've developed, we focus on sort of what the simplest way to talk about is national park level conservation lands. It does include the ocean as well. But this, and you're going to show us more as we proceed through this discussion, but in the United States, I think it's fair to say we would not be able to achieve the goals of Half Earth if we ignored private property. We cannot create enough national or even state-like park land in the United States. We could not convert enough agriculture to achieve the Half Earth goal. So I think, we don't want to stray from the notion that we need to be working toward half, and we need to be doing it now. At the same time, we recognize, of course, we want to be a rallying call and umbrella for all sorts of efforts. And, you know, I'm happy to take these kind of conservation success stories one at a time, because everyone counts and adds up. But obviously you're doing it on a scale that's really impressive, and exactly why I want to, you know, showcase this for our audiences.
Yeah, land trusts and half Earth. I think this is a big topic in the United States. There's a lot of private land, and for really big and important and lofty visions like half Earth, I think private landowners need to be engaged. The only thing that Northeast Wilderness Trust does, we fill a very narrow but important niche within the land trust community. And here in New England, we're the only land trust that's focused exclusively on forever wild conservation. There's a lot of great organizations that do this kind of work, but we really focus only on it, which is, I think, an important piece of the larger puzzle.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Dennis.
Well, these shots are beautiful, and I just want to mention, I want to thank you for providing them, because, you know, so often another important thing is for you know, people living in the United States to realize how, you know, saving biodiversity, the Half Earth Project, it's not just about sort of Africa, you know, rainforest. You know, there's these amazing tracts of land right here in the Northeast, the most, you know, densely populated, overall, the most densely populated region of the country. And yet here we have some amazing lands, some beautiful lands. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's just kind of look at this picture for a second. One of the neat things that we get to say at Northeast Wilderness Trust is that every single landscape that we've protected has the potential to become a future old growth forest, because on all of our forever wild preserves, there's zero agricultural activities, zero extraction, and no logging ever again. And that's an important piece of a larger puzzle. You know, obviously we need sustainable wood products, and that's an important part of our rural landscape, but we also need places that are set aside. So here in this picture, this is in the Adirondacks on a beautiful 2,500 acre preserve that we purchased last year. And everything in the foreground, this hill, all the way going down to that wetland that you can kind of see on the right-hand side of the picture, that is a forest that will never again be cut. And it's just going to get older and wilder and more diverse in perpetuity. And that's what Northeast Wilderness Trust does. It's a really exciting and, in my mind, hopeful premise for land conservation.
Yeah, oh, that's great. Beautiful.
So for people that aren't familiar with just what is a land trust, it's a weird word.
Yeah. It's a good, trust is a good word, but it's like
right, but it's different than what people often think of as like wills and estates and trusts.
Right.
A land trust is a nonprofit organization. This is from, oops, sorry about that. This is from the Land Trust Alliance. And basically land trusts are involved in acquiring property. We, as a community, focus largely on perpetual conservation, whether those are working forests or forever wild or farmland, whatever it may be. We generally work on perpetual conservation. And the two large tools that we do that with, or do it through, is conservation easements, which is a perpetual deed restriction that runs with the land forever. So when Bob and Sue protect their farm with a conservation easement after their lifetimes, that easement is there forever. And their successors and 3-4 generations down the road, they're all living with that conservation easement.
So John, could you just quickly just give a plain language explanation of an easement, if you don't mind?
Sure. An easement is a legal document. A conservation easement is a legal document that puts certain restrictions on a piece of property. So in law school, the most often used analogy is the bundle of sticks analogy. So when you own private land, you have a lot of bundles of sticks, and each, or I should say, you have a bundle of sticks, and each of those sticks is a right that you have.
Hmm.
So when you own land, you have the right to build a house on it, to cut trees, to farm it, to subdivide it. When you put a conservation easement on a property, you are either donating or selling a few of those sticks to
Yep.
the land trust. And the land trust retains forever often the right to develop your property, the right to subdivide it, in some cases, the right to harvest it. And then there's a lot of nuances, like perhaps you can still harvest trees on your property, but you have to do it in a more sustainable fashion than you used to.
Right.
So those are the many ways that it works.
And that's why you have this this little bit of a continuum here. You're saying in this that there is a restriction on development, improvement, changes to the land, but that there is a continuum from your purpose of your organization, wilderness, to more resource oriented, like sustainable logging, for example. There could be trusts devoted to that.
Yeah, and actually, as we'll see in a few slides, about 95+% of conservation in the Northeast is on the right side of that continuum, which is resource conservation, which again is very important. And we should be, the number one thing that we're all working on doing is avoiding forest conversion.
Mm-hmm.
And that all conservation easements do that. They generally prevent development. They, in one way or another, and there's lots of different variations, all conservation easements keep open space open. And then once you dig into the details of every transaction, that's where this continuum is. On the very left side or right side, it's not left or right, it's just somewhere. There's nature conservation.
Yeah.
And that's what Northeast Wilderness Trust is engaged in.
Right.
And then there's 100 different ways to get there, but then on the very other side, there's resource conservation, which is still preventing development, still preventing subdivision, but is allowing the continued extraction of resources, often in the way of agricultural activities or timber harvesting. Oil and gas development is often included in conservation easements.
I sometimes get asked about the Half Earth Project, like, how much money do you guys have banked to buy all this land, to acquire all this land? I love those questions, actually, and they often come from students who understandably think we're saying we're going to acquire half of the world in order to save it. And it's an interesting model, actually. But of course, I have to say, we're not doing that. And so, just to make sure I understand, how your organization and these trusts operate. So in essence, you're collecting these easements, you're procuring and having some stewardship and administration of these rights, right? So these lands remain in private ownership, but you're collecting the agreement about how they're going to be used. Is that a fair?
It is a fair, it's accurate for half of the cases, I would say. The Northeast Wilderness Trust, I'll only speak for us, but it's relatively common around the land trust community. We work with conservation easements for a lot of our transactions, but we also outright purchase property.
Okay, good.
So that property that we were just looking at in New York on the previous slide, we own that. It still is private because we are a private nonprofit organization.
Right.
Not in the public domain, but it is privately owned and conserved in perpetuity. And then, we also, as you mentioned accurately, the alternative to that is land remains owned by private individuals, and then we hold conservation easements on their properties. In the case of this beautiful forest in the background of this slide, we have a conservation easement on this property. This is 1,000 acres in southern New Hampshire. So it's owned, in this case, it's actually owned by a school. And we have a conservation easement over their property to maintain its wilderness character.
But were your organization to become insolvent in some way, dissolve, what are the protections? What would happen to those, to the lands? Let's just stick to the ones you own outright.
Sure. That makes it a little easier to answer. Uh, in the case of Northeast Wilderness Trust, we adhere to and strongly believe in a style of conservation that is often referred to as belt and suspender conservation, which means one organization conserving a piece of land is not enough. Much like sometimes a belt is not enough to hold your pants up and you need suspenders. So even when Northeast Wilderness Trust owns a piece of land, and we as an organization would never do anything that goes against our mission to it, we will always work with another land trust to put a conservation easement on our property. So that guarantees that perpetual promise. If Northeast Wilderness Trust were to go out of business, at the least, there's a conservation easement on that property, and whoever would own the property after our existence would have to adhere to the legal restrictions of that conservation easement. And I think that's a really important thing for private individuals to think about, but also land trusts. There is a lot of land, and Northeast Wilderness Trust has a few parcels that we own that don't yet have easements on them, and we're working on that. Mm-hmm. But it's really important for land trusts to think about your question and ensure that there is a plan. And I'm a big proponent of all land trusts putting conservation easements on their properties that they own. Yeah. And it's just another layer of protection when we're promising our donors, the general public, and wildlife that these properties are going to be here forever. And that's the best way to do that, in my mind. This is a picture of Burnt Mountain in northern Vermont. It's a 5,000 acre preserve that the Nature Conservancy owns, and we hold the Forever Wild easement over the Nature Conservancy's ownership. And that's a recent project that TNC just completed last year. And then they graciously donated the Forever Wild easement to Northeast Wilderness Trust for that same belt and suspender promise to the public and to wildlife. Even at Northeast Wilderness Trust, where we proudly say we protect nature for nature's sake, we also recognize that there is an incredible importance for people to experience these lands, love them, and as Sylvia Earle says, one of my favorite quotes, and I'll butcher it a little bit, but the general idea is you have to learn to love something before you're moved to save it. And national parks, national forests, state parks, private land, it's only going to be around if we have people falling in love with these places and dedicating their lives to conserving them. So even when you're on the extreme edge like Northeast Wilderness Trust and conserving nature really for nature, we also really go out of our way to find ways to balance that mission with human experiences so people become advocates and defenders of what we're doing. I got this information off the Land Trust Alliance website, which is kind of the umbrella organization that governs and maintains this land trust, national land trust movement. And so there are 1,500 land trusts across the USA. In places like Massachusetts, I mean, there's a land trust in every town, basically. Cool. And so that runs the gamut from local community organizations like the one I used to work in, Montezuma Land Conservancy, which focuses on a 3-county area in the extreme southwest corner of Colorado, to all volunteer-based organizations that focus on a single town somewhere, to regional organizations like Northeast Wilderness Trust. We work all across the Northeast. And then to our incredible national and international organizations. National being great ones like the Trust for Public Land and the Conservation Fund, to international organizations like the Nature Conservancy, which is the incredible leader in our field and probably the best known international conservation group. So of all of, now let's go back to just the United States. Of all of the land trusts in the United States, we as a movement have conserved in perpetuity 55 to 65 million acres protected. That's a pretty incredible number. And I have this range here because the last LTA census data is a few years old. And I looked at kind of how it's been growing over the last few censuses. Censi, I don't know what the plural for that is. So,
yeah, I think it's census anyways.
yeah, so I just kind of extrapolated and said, I think there's probably today about 55 to 65 million acres of land protected by land trusts across the country.
Yeah.
That is bigger than New England.
That's good.
And about 3/4 of the size, a half to 3/4 of the size of the state of California, which is pretty amazing. So, yeah, as you mentioned, Dennis, there is no half in the United States without private land. To get to that goal here, land trusts are an integral part of that movement.
I like numbers like that, John, because first of all, I had no sense that California was twice the land area of New England. So that's a revelation. But yeah, those numbers are stunning. 50 plus 60 million acres. It's extraordinary.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's a big number. And let me keep pointing out these pretty pictures. So this is a wilderness preserve in central Maine that we own. So let's go back to that concept. This is about 7,000 acres of beautiful wetlands, and we own it in fee, and we've partnered with a wonderful organization, which is a statewide organization called the Forest Society of Maine. And they hold a forever wild easement on our property. So there's that belt and suspender concept again. That's a picture of Howard Zonheiser, who is the primary author of the Wilderness Act of 1964. And I think that requires a little bit of attention while we're talking about wilderness conservation, especially in the context of New England, because people often ask, can wilderness even exist in New England, a region of millions and millions of people, 99.9% cut over since European settlement. There's roads everywhere. When you think of wilderness in the Western context of setting aside these vast regions that have never been disturbed, that is not what exists anywhere in New England for the most part. Right. So the simple answer to the question is, can wilderness exist in New England? Is of course. And it does not rest on finding places that were somehow spared the axe or the Industrial Revolution over the last 400 years. And that comes down to a very specific word that Howard Zonheiser used when he was drafting the Wilderness Act, which is the word untrammeled. He knew that wilderness could grow as well as shrink, and he consciously used that word in the law's definition. He did not use the word pristine or ancient or untouched, but untrammeled, which is something that is free or unimpeded. Wilderness, I'll just read it, is not simply a special kind of place, but rather the special commitment that we, Northeast Wilderness Trust, or anyone doing this, make to a place. And that commitment is freedom to animals and to the natural processes that produce integrity, beauty, and diversity of the land community. So again, wilderness is a choice, and it's a management style. It's not, this piece of land has been cut before, and thus it's not worthy or able to be considered wilderness.
Right.
And to that point, if wilderness is a choice, then wilderness by definition can be found anywhere where humans decide to show some humility and make that choice. And the reason I'm showing this specific picture, this looks like a pretty wild landscape. It's in Massachusetts, and we own it, and it's wilderness. And so the moment that Northeast Wilderness Trust protects a place, we make that commitment, and we're taking that intentional step to set aside and let nature do its thing. And this property is adjacent to a Walmart supercenter, whatever they're called.
Right.
A bunch of housing subdivisions. It's in a, what I guess would be best defined as an ex-urban landscape.
Hmm.
But nonetheless, on this property, there's 36 vernal pools, a number of endangered species, an incredible coastal plain pond, which you're looking at right here.
Beautiful.
And even in this urban context, the Muddy Pond Wilderness Preserve is indeed wilderness. It's about the commitment that we make to the property to afford it time and space to be free.
Yep.
So that's what we're talking about at Northeast Wilderness Trust. And I think it's one of the reasons that our work aligns so beautifully with the vision of Half Earth.
Yeah, absolutely. And these spaces, I mean, they're so important because, again, it's not exotic. It's not just about exotic locales in Asia and Africa. It's not just about iconic national parks in the West. It's not even about just the Adirondacks. These places are important. And in fact, this is where the majority of the population of, especially students, for example, are likely to encounter and get an understanding of what a wild place even is, to understand what it means when you have a bunch of species interacting in a place in a wild way, in a natural way. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and so it's great that you brought that up, because at Muddy Pond Wilderness Preserve, which is, again, not in a far off location in northern New England, this is 45 minutes from Fenway Park. It's in the middle of urban Massachusetts. Northeast Wilderness Trust has designated this property and a few of our other properties what we call ambassador properties. And it's exactly what you were just saying. These properties, unlike most of our land, have hiking trails on them. We're in the process of building some kiosks for educational opportunities. And we look at these ambassadors as that opportunity for kids, adults alike, to come out and experience what a wild forest looks like in their neighborhood or in their county or in their region. Not everyone has the privilege or luxury to be able to travel to northern Maine and experience, the Allagash. But through our programming, we're working to try to get people out to this property, especially people that don't have an opportunity to drive places. We're working with schools to get them out to Muddy Pond Wilderness Preserve. And we're exposing a new generation of people to not only wilderness, but just open space. We've had some kids come out on this property that have never been in a forest before.
Right.
And how do we expect that generation to care about these places in the future and become our champions and defenders of conservation if they don't experience it growing up? So ambassador landscapes are different than the rest of our properties in that they do have more human use, but they are central. They're at the core of our mission, which is to conserve forever wild landscapes. And you can't conserve forever wild landscapes if people are apathetic to it. You need people to fall in love with these places. And that we are just so incredibly privileged to be able to experience wilderness. It's something that I never thought about. I can just get in my car and drive and go camping whenever I want. And that is just an incredible luxury that's not afforded to most people.
Right.
And for a vision like Half Earth to ever be realized, what is a kid growing up in inner city Boston, how can he or she relate to this vision without getting outside and experiencing the miracle of nature and wilderness? So I think that there is absolutely a ripe opportunity for organizations like ours to collaborate and just do the best job we can to get people outside and break down those barriers to experiencing nature, open space in a safe and educational way.